Another Souls-like? Seriously? I know. Plenty of you guys are already tired of the genre, but hey, I consider myself a pretty big Souls fan, and I've made it a point to try out as many of these games as I can. So enter Morbid, the Lords of Ire, a small game developed by Still Running and published by Merge Games. With such a small team of developers, was Morbid a game that broke through the mold and differentiated itself from others in the genre? Or was it doomed to be lost in the sheer quantity of Souls-like games we have? Keep watching the Xbox Era review to find out. Morbid, the Lords of Ire, is technically a sequel to Still Running's previous game, Morbid, the Seven Acolytes, which was an isometric take on the same formula, but to be honest, it's not really that relevant. Having never played the first game, I pretty quickly got the gist of what was happening story-wise. You play as Striver, a warrior of some kind that has to go and kill 5 acolytes because they're evil or possessed or something. It doesn't really matter. Go to these 5 areas and kill the bosses there, okay? There is some story and lore as you play, of course. These acolytes and the various enemies you face are possessed by Galers, and your job is to rid them of flesh to control. Clearly, the story or plot isn't the focus here, with even the voice acting leaving a fair bit to be desired. Instead, Morbid, the Lords of Ire focuses primarily on the combat and level design, and it does a pretty good job. So right away, as with most Souls-like, I assumed it would play clunky, the level design would be weak, the enemies either too frustrating or too easy, and that it would focus on some gimmick addition to separate itself. This game mostly avoids all those issues in a way plenty of the previous Souls-like I played rarely did. To start, the game is relatively simple. You equip a weapon, it has a specific moveset that it shares with other weapons in the same family, and you start swinging or smashing away. This seems like the usual affair, with RB being one attack and RT being another, but it does differ slightly. See, every enemy in the game has 2 bars, an HP bar at the top, and a bar that determines if they stagger and open up for a stronger attack. I found that RB attacks mostly targeted the HP of an enemy, while right trigger attacks targeted the bottom bar. You'll need to learn to combine these, as enemies put a lock on the bottom bar, which reduces how much damage you can do to their HP until you hit them with an RT attack. This worked pretty well for me, as I weaved my attacks as needed, especially as I'd stagger my enemies half the time with my giant axe. The game also gives you a ranged single-use gun that reloads when you kill something, as a way to instantly stagger enemies and take a chunk off of the bottom bar. Finally, with the right timing, you can also parry an attack, which then opens up the enemy to a stronger attack that primarily targets their HP. All of these combat systems work very well with each other, especially once you learn an enemy's moveset and determine whether it might or might not even be worth fully breaking their guard, and instead just targeting their HP. It also really helps that you can roll out of an attack without fully committing to it. In terms of maneuverability, you have a full roll by using B and a small instant dodge by using A. I thought the dodge was an interesting idea, but in practice, I stuck with either strafing around enemies or doing the full roll. It could just be muscle memory from previous Souls games, but I definitely did not trust a slight shuffle to get me out of harm's way. You can also block normal enemy attacks by holding the left bumper, which is the first step needed to parry. The game does bring in another mechanic to this whole foray, the insanity system, but I found that it doesn't really affect your playstyle much. Essentially, as you play and defeat enemies, your sanity will either go up, go down, or stay neutral. Going up means your EXP multiplier, more on this later, increases, your stamina consumption decreases, and you deal more guard damage. Your insanity going down increases the damage you both do and take, but if the bar is low enough, then you may see specters of recently defeated enemies appear soon after you kill them. These specters do more damage but are easier to kill. In practice, I mostly ignored the system. Even when I would be fully insane or enlightenment, it didn't change my style of swing and smash everything I saw, which I think works for the better, as all too often, Souls-like games focus too much on what differentiates them. This system adds a small flavor of change, but it doesn't get in your way or annoy you enough to want it gone. Now, 2 things are essential for a Souls-like to be even half decent: good enemies and enemy variety, and good level design. Morbid, the Lords of Ire, certainly has a first while doing a serviceable job on the latter. There's the occasional cheap enemy mob out there, but I found that as long as I took the time to learn the attack patterns, then most enemies were fair but still challenging. Even when put in situations where I was surrounded by 3 or 4 enemies and my retreat path was cut off, as long as I didn't panic, I'd be able to roll, parry, smash, and shoot a bloody path out. Landing a parry can be huge, as it gets an enemy close to being fully staggered, which then locks you into an animation where you can't be hit. Sure, it's not the most immersive thing, but I appreciated that Morbid prioritized being a game first and foremost. There are a few bosses as well, of course, with each area having an optional side boss and then a main one at the end of the path. For the most part, the bosses were fun and had decent variety. One of them did have me scratching my head on how the fight ended, but the others look cool and the main bosses put up a decent enough challenge to a veteran Souls player, as in each fight, -1, it took me at least a few tries to defeat. Like the enemies in the game, it's all about being patient and learning boss move patterns. Knowing when to parry, when to break guard, when to attack, and when to focus on either the HP or guard bar is of utmost importance. And lastly comes level design, where Morbid, the Lords of Ire, does a decent enough job. It's the usual affair of mostly linear pathways with a few branches here and there, and then shortcuts you can open that shorten your death run or lead you back to a previous rest point. To be honest, there's nothing really special here. There's also nothing that sticks out as terrible either. It's very serviceable level design for folks who are used to playing similar games, with consumables scattered throughout every nook and cranny. Every so often you'll find a separate path that leads you to the optional boss of the area, but for the most part, the levels are pretty linear as you progress through. Before we move on, I need to talk about two more things: how the EXP and level up system works, and how you upgrade your weaponry. For the first one, as you play the game and defeat enemies, you gain both EXP and an increase to your EXP multiplier. Reaching Enlightenment also increases this multiplier, but if you die, it goes straight back to 0. When the EXP bar fills up, you're rewarded with a skill point, which you'll need to save as you need 5 to do anything and more to do anything else. Soon after starting the game, you unlock the Blessing system, which is a mix of both leveling up and ring systems for those familiar to the Dark Souls games. You can equip various blessings you find in one of 3 unlockable slots, and you can then upgrade those blessings using accumulated skill points. For example, a blessing can increase your HP or stamina, and then the first upgrade could increase your healing or how quickly your stamina regenerates. Every blessing can be upgraded twice, with the second one costing a whopping 20 skill points, but usually providing something big too, like reviving after dying for the first time. Finally, the game has a weapon upgrade / gem slot system, but it's a little different from the usual affair. Essentially, as you play through the game, you'll find various runes which you can then slot onto your weapons. These runes come with both a benefit, like increased damage, and a cost, like reduced speed. After filling all the slots in a weapon, you can then infuse it, which consumes the runes but increases the base stats of the weapon based on what you had slotted. And then, after you infuse a weapon twice, you can create a Grand Rune, which uses a rare consumable item to create a rune that adds a percentage of all the previous ones you used. Yeah, this sounds a little complicated in writing, but in practice I just popped on whatever damage and speed runes I found and kept infusing them. I'm sure there's a way to min-max these, but that was absolutely not required. Visuals wise, when I started Morbid, the first thought in my head was that this looked a lot like an early last generation game. While the art design definitely improved or surprised me as the game progressed, the actual visuals are nothing to write home about. I never actively thought that certain parts looked bad, but I also rarely had moments of whoa either. Heck, the main one I had was when I entered an area that looked like it was straight out of Lies of P, which led to a slight chuckle. The game certainly has a certain edginess to it though, as some of the later areas are full of as much gore as I think the code could handle. Even when you hit enemies, you see a giant spattering of blood. I'm not sure if this was intended to be serious or humorous, but I certainly found it to be more of the latter. The music and sound design was also serviceable, with boss or combat tracks doing their job of upping tension, and area tracks doing their job at emphasizing the various themes or art design. It's in the visuals though where the budget nature of the game truly shows. Menus and UI look like placeholders, while fonts and dialogue boxes are extremely basic. But this is a game made by a small team without all the bells and whistles in production that larger studios can provide, so it didn't really bother me too much. Thankfully, my playthrough was almost entirely without any bugs at all. There were times where I thought for sure that I was stuck, but I was able to roll or shuffle my way out no problem. I did have one enemy that just stared at me without attacking, which is pretty funny, but otherwise I had no technical issues at all in my playthrough. In conclusion, Morbid, the Lords of Ire is an interesting game. When I started my playthrough a few days ago, I went in with low expectations thinking this would just be another Soulslike game that's average at best. But as I kept playing and got better at the combat systems, I started to truly enjoy myself and any nitpicking I was doing stopped. Heck, I initially thought this review was going to be half the length. While the level design is serviceable and the budget of the game clearly shows in things like the UI, the combat flows very well once you get a hang of it, and the game is always giving you more monstrosities to slash into ribbons. Morbid, the Lords of Ire might not be the best Soulslike I've played, but it's absolutely one of the better games in the genre. And considering it's launching far away from a full-priced game, it's hard not to recommend it for fans of the genre looking for something familiar but still fun enough to have a good time.